you. So at the outset, I would like to thank Bahujan Students Front for giving me this opportunity. So I've just recently, just a minute. So I have just recently completed my first year in post graduation, and I also do not come from a social science background, but I've been engaging with Professor Ailes' works for quite some time now. So I would like to talk from the standpoint of a student who is trying to engage with the academia and what Professor Ailes' works have to offer to such students. I personally feel that there is a need to recognize the importance of certain intellectuals within their own lifetime, especially after especially after Gauri Lankesh's episode and many other such happenings. I feel that the position of intellectuals in this country is not really safe. So, facilitating a conducive environment would add more dimensions to the current understanding of our social realities. So, this is what had essentially happened with Ambedkar as well. Ambedkar's ideas were also not respected enough during his own lifetime. If you look at it, it was only during the later part of the 20th century that the inevitability of Ambedkarite thought was largely acknowledged, certainly due to various factors. So, the problem here is sociologists, mostly coming from the upper caste backgrounds, have not really examined the Dalit and tribal lifestyles in order to account for the differences from the mainstream Hindu society. So this led to a production of certain works that have tried to impose a kind of monolithic identity upon different sections of people. So if you look at the current social situation, the right-wing forces are also essentially trying to do the same. They are also trying to impose a kind of identity upon different sections of people. So what essentially happens in the closed room scholarly work, in a sense, affects and is also facilitating such a change in the society. So, in the midst of all this crisis, Professor Ailes' writings have emerged as a savior of social sciences, I would say. Because, frankly speaking, most of us are interested in going abroad to pursue a higher education and later on adopt the same Western methods of research. But Professor Ailes took a completely opposite direction. He went back to his village roots. He examined the productive labor. He examined the question of dignity of labor. And he tried to establish a linkage with the larger Hindu structure. So, not only going back to his village, but he also uplifted the importance of village roots to the international level with his writings. So, for me, the most crucial aspect of his work is that he did not confine himself to abstract ideas of research. Rather, he worked out a systematic framework in order to express his dissent. For example, the concept of spiritual fascism, for instance. We were all worried about political democracy and things like that. But he came up with this concept called spiritual democracy, which in turn affects political democracy. Because ultimately, if you were to do good in politics, the spiritual sanction becomes utmost necessary. So he basically explained the larger unequal Hindu structure, which labels certain lower caste cultures as inferior. And he also highlighted the importance of lower caste food cultures, especially the right to eat beef. He then came up with this argument called anti-national vegetarianism to counter the larger vegetarian nationalist forces in the country. He later on went further to extend this argument to the national security question by highlighting the importance of non-vegetarian food in the production of the country as well. So you look at the broader framework that has been worked out. He starts from the spiritual question. He extends the argument to low caste food cultures. From there onwards, he progresses to the national security question. On the other hand, Sanskrit, a language again which has its source in the Hindu spiritual system, the upper caste had given upon this language after Sanskrit started losing its ground to English. So you also see Professor Riley emphasizing on the need for English medium education for Dalit Bahujans to become global. So you look at all of these positions, you do not find any contradictions. So any school of thought that emerges organically out of productive roots would reproduce itself in such a way to tackle these different issues in the society, I feel. Uh, so to me, his personal identity also becomes a part of his work because coming from an OBC background and fighting for the cause of Dalits and Adivasis is in itself a rare combination, I would say, especially given the tendency of OBCs to align with the upper caste. If you look at it, we hardly have some 9 OBC professors across the universities in the country, according to the latest UGC report. Even my previous institute itself had, very few lower caste professors. So I was fortunate enough to have come across Professor Ailer's writings, after which I had understood the limitation of such a one-dimensional pedagogy. Because we must understand, basically the universities are knowledge production centers, and there is a need to democratize the whole knowledge generation and dissemination processes. And this could only happen if we allow professors coming from diverse backgrounds to be accommodated in those universities. But that is not happening right now. The definition of what constitutes knowledge has also been under the hegemonic control of upper caste till now. If you look at his seminal work, Post Hindu India, he gave all modern English names to all the lower caste productive occupations. He talked about tribals as unpaid teachers because they were the ones who gave us the standardized food culture that we are accustomed to right now. He talked about Dalits as subaltern scientists. They were the first ones who established the leather industry in this country. He talked about shepherds as meat and milk economists. He talked about barbers as social doctors. So in that text, he basically tried to differentiate between the productive castes who were historically involved in production related activities and the parasite castes, basically the Brahmin Baniya caste, who did not soil their hands, but they thrived on the lower caste labor. So this kind of enumeration of lower caste occupations knowledge and the scientificity associated with such knowledge has provided a sense of philosophical foundation for the lower caste to assert their identity. Because we must understand that the upper caste behavior has the philosophical backing of Vedas. Ambedkar studied Vedas more than anyone else, but he critiqued those texts from the same sophisticated background, and that was a different kind of approach. But you see, Professor Ailayat takes a bottom-up approach, and at this juncture, in terms of methodology, Professor Ailayat differs from Ambedkar. But you see, in many other aspects, his writings also complement to Ambedkar's writings as well. Ambedkar talked about social importance of social democracy in relation to political democracy. You also see Professor Riley talks about a spiritual democracy, which is a major determinant of many other democracies that would follow. So in that sense, he also expands and expands the scope of Ambedkar's argument as well. So earlier, whenever there was a discussion on merit or caste or reservation, the lower caste were always put on the defensive. But the inferiority complex associated with their own identity has started to slowly dissolve with these kind of writings, I would say. So coming to the question of methodology, even Professor Ram Shepherd wrote about his methodology at length. And he basically used experience as a framework of research. And I completely understand that because caste is a very, very complex issue. and you cannot take a cursory look at it, or you cannot have a bird eye approach. You have to dwell deeper into the caste question. You have to live among Dalits and tribals. So you cannot just simply have a closed room approach. So this even Professor Ailes' writings have their own limitations, in the sense that you cannot generalize his results, because they were particularly done in a geographical setting, particularly the Telugu states. You can also examine his methods. You see, by using other his results, basically by using other methods of research as well. So Professor Ailes makes a very pertinent point in his recent book, The Shudras, wherein he says, the ignorance of caste question by the Congress and the Communist parties has led to the rise of the current political dispensation that banked upon the same caste question and projected itself as a pro-Shudra party. So this highlights the importance of engaging with the caste question. So it is also important about what is the approach you take towards this caste question. So coming to the question of how to engage with Professor Ailes' writings, I would like to give you an example. I've recently written an article on Gandhi, in which I've said, see, Gandhi deserves all respect for his fight against racism in South Africa. Though there were contestations that Gandhi differentiated between Indian blacks and the other blacks, but nevertheless he at least fought against the racism directed towards Indian blacks. But the same Gandhi perpetuated racism after perpetuated racism by supporting caste system after he returned to India. So drawing upon Professor Ailes' concept of caste as a race, in which he clearly says the white cow is the most venerated and legally protected animal, despite of giving less milk compared to the black buffalo. But the Hindu scriptures does not accord the same amount of respect or sanctity to the black buffalo. So this shows how caste reinforces race and color in the Indian context. And the same Gandhian double standards could be seen if you look at the recent Black Lives Matter campaign. The upper caste citizens were outrageous in their support towards the Black Lives Matter campaign, ignoring their own culpability in the oppression of Dalit Bahujan Adivasis back home. So in this way, you could engage with Professor Ailes' writings in order to understand how, in order to create new dimensions of understanding historical personalities and society at large. And one thing I have basically learned from Professor Ailes' writings is that the upper caste hypocrisy is something that we have to contest on a daily basis. See, of late, this has become a trend to call oneself as an anti-caste vegan. I don't really understand this point, this term. How can you be anti-caste and a vegan at the same time? After all, veganism has its source in the caste system, which you're trying to, do away with in the first place. So it's kind of oxymoronic to call oneself an anti-caste vegan. I'm highlighting this over here because most of the Dalit Bahujans are falling in this trap, wherein upper castes are basically appealing to the moral conscience of the oppressed in the name of animal rights and environmental concerns. But as Professor Ailes also rightly mentions in his autobiography, we must understand that the upper caste Hindus were never involved in the rearing of cattle. They never milked the cows. What they did was they drank the cow's milk, which was also a violent process according to their own definitions of violence. So the same hypocrisy could be seen in the slaughterhouses as well. Consider for example the pet food industry in India. I've gone through some of these industries, and if you look at it, most at the top end of these organizations, you find most of them are upper caste Hindus. what is pet food? Pet food is basically chicken meal, mutton meal, and all kinds of non-vegetarian food. So they produce non-vegetarian food for dogs, but they propose and propagate vegetarianism for vast masses who are involved in hard labor day in and day out. So the same hypocrisy could be seen in the slaughterhouses as well. Read The Democratic Right to Eat Beef, written by Professor Ilya. He also, in that, he says, if you look at the major slaughterhouses, the majority of shareholding is with the upper caste Hindus. So in the day you parade as cattle protectors, and in the night you silently export beef. So this kind of double standards has to be contested on a daily basis, I feel. And coming to having said all of that, coming to the Shudra question, I have a couple of questions for Professor Ilya. And see, I feel the Shudra category is a very, very broad category, and also a kind of controversial category, I would say, because most of the political parties, at least in the North India, have included a lot of castes which do not have an agrarian Shudra background into this OBC fold. And you see, there is also a major chunk of OBC population out there who do not really respect Ambedkar usually as Dalits do. I hope this book goes a long way in reforming the larger Shudra consciousness. But interestingly, Shashi Tharoor wrote a book, Why I'm a Hindu. And initially I thought that was a response to your Why I'm Not a Hindu. But later on I've realized that that book has a kind of political context, in the sense that it tried to differentiate between Hinduism as a way of life and Hindutva as a political identity. And in that, he claims himself to be a Hindu because he was born one. And that was the lamest explanation I've ever come across. Coming from a Shudra Nayak background, if he sees no problem in the proposition that the Shudras were born from the feet of so-called divine Brahma, what kind of reform could we expect from such Shudra intellectuals? And do you think that the reins of anti-caste movement could be handed over to Shudras at this point of time? Or do you feel that the anti-caste movement has to be primarily led by Dalits, with all other allies contributing to it? And also, coming to the Shudras book, this book basically uses the Shudra, OBC, and Bahujan terms interchangeably, which is also a bit problematic. Because as we all know, Shudra is a historical category, OBC is an administrative category, and Bahujan is a much broader category, which also involves, religious minorities as well. So I came across a very pertinent critique of this book. You might have also come across it, but that strongly resonates with my point of contention. So I would like to quote just a few sentences from that, so that you could answer if you have to. So he says, this was written by Professor Ravikanta Kishan. So he says, the term Shudra has been interchangeably used in the book with the contemporary term OBC. This is, however, misleading. Over 5,000 castes have been listed as OBCs, and a sizable portion among them do not belong to OBC groups historically associated with Shudra identity. So the OBC, but as mentioned earlier, the OBC discourse in mainstream media always uses the term to refer to a relatively homogeneous collection of groups, mostly associated with landed agrarian castes such as Yadavs, Jats, Kurmis, Vokaligas, and so on. However, even collectively taken, these castes do not come close to representing the vast and varied social experience of the groups listed as OBCs. An estimated 85% of Indian Muslims come from Pasmanda backgrounds, and many of them are listed as OBCs. Who is to be the voice of Pasmanda OBCs, even as they remain doubly marginalized for their faith and caste identities? Scheduled Caste Order 1950, popularly known as the Presidential Order of 1950, restricts the granting of scheduled caste status to Muslims. Many such oppressed communities frequently find themselves listed as OBCs. So this was the point he was trying to make.
Arvind,
Yeah.
Please conclude.
Yeah. So I would like. Yeah, I would like to stop here and I would like to listen from other panelists as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Arvind, for your engagement with Professor Kanchaila's work. Thank you for emphasizing on the local roots and the necessity for academicians to engage more with the lived experience of people rather than abstract ideas alone. This is the uniqueness in Professor Kanchaila's work throughout, basically. That bottom-up approach that you were talking about, that framework, and how you rightly pointed out that it is continuation with Dr. Ambedkar's work, and at the same time, different from Ambedkar's work. So thank you for putting forth your ideas on Professor Kanchaila's work. Now we have Mr. Praveen Talapalli. Praveen Talapalli is a PhD candidate at the Center for Political Studies, JNU. He broadly works on phenomenology, hermeneutics, and modern Indian political thought. He has also contested as presidential candidate from BAPSA's panel in the year 2018. Now I request Praveen Talapalli to make his presentation. Praveen Talapalli.
Yeah. At the outset, let me thank Kathi Anil, Mani, and Parshu for engaging with me since my master's days, and also for this talk, Anil and Mani had asked me to speak, and I thank both of them for inviting me to speak on an important anti-caste student organization called the Bahujan Students' Friend from the University of Hyderabad. See, there are a couple of writings of Professor Ailaya that one essentially would want to read, and if you want to read, if one wants to understand Ailaya, one shouldn't leave any of his newspaper article even, or let's say the articles that he writes in Telugu newspapers also. So how does one engage with Ailaya, and why should one engage with Ailaya? What does Ailaya actually do to the Indian political? Indian political is Ambedkar's term from the book Pakistan or Partition of India. And what does it do as a professor? Most of the professorial class in India are actually university pedagogues who are largely not known to the larger public. Hardly there are any public intellectuals in India, and Ailaya stands one among those very few public intellectuals who have continuously engaged the Indian political since, let's say, the 1995 or so. And it is almost 25 to 26 years that the book Why I'm Not a Hindu is published. Ailaya is celebrated for his book Why I'm Not a Hindu, and as everyone says, classics are something that everyone quotes but no one reads. But the last review that I read of Why I'm Not a Hindu is by Gauri Lankesh in the year 2016 in the Bangalore Mirror. I want to engage with Ailaya in the very first place. As a student of political science, doing my undergrads at Delhi University, we had to go to a protest where A.K. Ramanujan's many Ramayans, 300 Ramayans, many Ramayanas text was banned. And then I was already having an idea that who is Professor Kanchaila's. Once I have attended that protest rally, in none of the protest rallies, nobody had mentioned Ailaya's name or any of Ailaya's work. So then I realized, why is Ailaya not spoken in this public meeting per se by none of the academics of Delhi University? But I thought I was too naive to understand it then. And I already had read Why I'm Not a Hindu by then, and I had a fair understanding of what Ailaya writes, and I've been following his work. Why I'm Not a Hindu comes at the backdrop of his essay in EPW in which he wrote Experiences Framework. It is only after Phule and Ambedkar that it is coming very seriously from the social sciences that experience should be a framework. Majority of the people who have written from the experience experiential point of view, have gone on to lament their life stories, and which is now called partly as Dalit literature and Dalit studies, which is doing nothing great but just selling the victimhood per se. So in my student days, in my student activism, I've invited Ilaiah a couple of times to JNU, and in the 2014, I've invited him to speak on caste and Indian left. This was on behalf of UDSF, and in 2018, he had come to speak on knowledge production and repression in April 2018. And when his books were banned in Delhi University, in the November 2018 book ban, he spoke on book Truth and Method, Reading Social Sciences and Pedagogy in Indian Universities. In October 2017, when the chapter Social Smugglers was translated into Telugu, the committee or the Bania community, when it had attacked Ilaiah, Bapsa had organized a solidarity meeting for Professor Ilaiah. And in all of the meetings, I was engaging with Ilaiah either by chairing it or by being a discussant of something of this kind. Whenever I get to meet or speak to Professor Ilaiah, apart from his writings, what I always learn is he always asks, what did you write in the recent past? Unless you write, there is nothing that can be spoken of. So it is important that Indian universities learn the act of writing. I myself, being a student of JNU, I can tell you very honestly that Indian universities do not promote the act of writing, especially particularly public universities like BU, JNU, and also some other public universities. So from Ilaiah, if one has to speak, one has to write. So this is something that that I find always interesting. Keeping aside all of this, so let me read out what I wrote. Why I want to read out is because there is a lot of work that Professor Ilaiah has worked on, and it is almost like an MPhil project to work on to present on Ilaiah's writings. And if one wants to do a PhD, then one has to learn Telugu and also read his Telugu writings as well. Philosopher Bertrand Russell argued that the world needs open hearts and open minds in his book Why I'm Not a Christian and other essays on religion and related subjects. Kancha Ilaiah, in his book Why I'm Not a Hindu, argued that, let me make it clear, however, that I'm not writing this book to convince suspicious Brahminical minds. I'm writing this book for all those who have open minds. He continues that a people who refuse to listen to new questions and learn new answers will perish and not prosper. In agreement with Russell and Ilaiah, I speak today not to convince those who wish to play to the gallery of Brahmanism, but to have a dialogue with all those who are against caste, Brahmanism, patriarchy, capitalism, etc., both in terms of writing and praxis. I am giving this precondition as there is no seriousness among the Indian and Western academics to develop schools of anti-caste thought in knowledge production, and also there is barely any respect for the critics towards each other. It is needless to mention that only the gang, that is academic gang members, are respected, promoted and revered. Here I take John Dewey's definition of gang. Within the university-based anti-caste spaces, there is intolerance towards the people who critique Gopal Guru, and now the intolerance is exhibited to the people who critique Kancha Ilaiah. Having been a student of JNU, who has attended 3 semesters classes of Professor Guru, one could easily argue with Guru in his classroom. But beyond the classroom, if there is an attempt to criticize Guru, you would always see an army of students. You would always see an army of students who call themselves as working in, let's say, socio-political thought or intellectual history, always try to vanguard Guru. This vanguarding of Guru has not let Guru's writing expand. This is also going to happen with the writings of Kancha Ilaiah. I'm saying this because very recently, when his latest work, The Shudras, published by Penguin, when it was published, the critique that was generated, let's say on social media, was really not taken into good condition. So I initially started writing a critique and then I dropped it. I was like, if this is the response that I'm getting from, if this is the response that one can see on the public spaces, then it's better not to write. And I must also say it very clearly, Ailaya is very unfortunate that he is born in a very wrong generation, for the fact that he doesn't have good interlocutors. He doesn't have some people who could engage with him very seriously. When from the period 1910s to 1940, what is Hindu, what could be Hindu, and what is the nature of Hindu and Hinduism was debated and written publicly. People like M.K. Gandhi, Gokhale, Savarkar, Aurobindo, Madan Mohan Malviya, Ambedkar were addressing to these questions. And all these people were the successors of Phule, Ranade, and Chiplunkar. Ambedkar and Phule were so fortunate because they were engaging in a philosophical, or let's say intellectual debate with their contemporaries. But there is no one in the times of Ailaya except D.R. Nagaraj and also the Rayalaseema person Nagapakar Sundarraju, who has only these are the two people who have thematically critiqued Ailaya, and of course Ailaya's response to them did not really come out well. Between Phule and Ambedkar, there is an intellectual continuity, and there is also a departure. There are differences on their approaches on theology and emancipation, and Ailaya actually does not fall into the very school of thought that Phule and Ambedkar belongs to. Ailaya has his own school of thought, and he doesn't share any of the philosophical or political concerns with Phule or Ambedkar. This is the basic premise of the. This is the basic premise in which I want to argue today. Ailaya in the book Why I'm Not Hindu argued that Phule is definitely the first modern thinker to write on Shudras and Shudras. Ailaya argued that there are problems in using the same conceptions now. At the same time, there was no clear division between Shudra upper caste, whom Ailaya categorizes as Neo-Kshatriyas in his book, and the OBCs in general. This kind of conceptualization has its own problem. This is again Ailaya. So let me continue what Ailaya has more to say. Kancha Ailaya argued that the concept Shudra has been used by Brahmanical writers in a derogatory sense. It does not communicate a feeling of self-respect and political assertion. Phule's usage, however, is to be preferred to the abusive Brahmanical terms like Chandala, Mleka, Raksha, and so on. Even an anglicized terms like untouchable is equally acceptable. Ailaya continues that Ambedkar could never develop a secular term that could refer to the OBC caste collectively. Now this is Ailaya speaking about the Shudras in 1996, and he categorically argued that the Neo-Kshatriyas here mean the Jats, Gujars, Patels, Kammas, Kapus also, have become the saviors of Brahmanism. Now, 25 years later, Ailaya is speaking against himself. He speaks against himself, firstly in the Caravan essay, Where Are the Shudras? In the Caravan essay, Ailaya is arguing that Shudras are nowhere in the public sphere. But Ailaya basically forgot to mention that the political sphere in the northern India and also in the states of Karnataka and also the Telugu states are predominantly occupied by the Shudra caste. The Vokkaligas are leading JDS, Kammas lead TDP, Yadavas lead Samajwadi Party and RJD in UP Bihar, Kurmis lead Janata Dal United by Nitish Kumar. So Shudras are in the public sphere. So when Shudras are in the political public sphere, they are deciding what is Indian political. See, in 1990s, as everyone agreed, and many have written that Mandal was a watershed in Indian political. So when Mandal could change the Indian political, for let's say until now, before Modi, Mandal was the predominant Indian political thing. What did these political parties do in terms of understanding the Shudra category? None of these political parties have actually addressed or understood what is the Shudra in the 20th century, or let's say the 21st century. This is not written in the Caravan article. Now, after the Caravan article, once I had met Ilaiah sir, and I told sir there are these loopholes, there are these lacunas in this article, and he said, "Why don't you write?" I actually thought of writing, but I'm writing my PhD, so therefore I really couldn't finish that article. But the very recent book of Shudras also did not address any of these concerns. Though in the introduction there is a passing reference to all these North Indian political sphere. So what one must understand is, see, Ambedkar published his book Who Were Shudras almost, let's say, in 1948 or 47, 48, something like that. It's almost like 75 years time period, and in the 75 years time period, Shudras have transitioned. So now, even the Mandal Commission's report itself has to be questioned now. The research of Mandal Commission is actually inadequate. And some of the researchers who have worked with Mandal Commission have gone to term the landowning Shudra caste as the dominant caste. And it is ironic to see that Professor Ilaiah, rather than understanding the lacunas of the Mandal Commission, he's responding to M.N. Srinivas in the book Why I'm Not Hindu. I'll talk about this in a bit, in a couple of minutes. So how do you study the Shudras now? What is the methodology to study the Shudras now? It is very clear. If one reads Phule's Gulamgiri, Phule actually uses historical sociology. For the sake of this public talk, I'm using this. There are so many methods in Phule, but for the convenience of everyone today, I can tell that Phule had used historical anthropology and historical sociology when he was writing the book Gulamgiri, and also in his other works when he understood Shudra. But in Professor Ilaiah, in Why I'm Not a Hindu, he writes Why I'm Not Hindu from his experiential point of view. That is not the whole and soul of entire Shudras, even in the Telugu speaking states. Forget about North India or the other South Indian states. In the book Shudras, published in the latest Shudras book of the Penguin, none of the chapters have theoretical clarity. None of the chapters have methodological clarity. And I do not blame Ilaiah, I blame the editors. Caravan, I don't want to blame them precisely because it is not an academic journal. Though very important articles come in Caravan, but Caravan people are not academic, so they will not be. And also, it's a problem if an academic is a celebrity. Ilaiah is almost like a celebrity. Ilaiah is almost like a big public intellectual who is no less than, let's say, if Ilaiah were to be born in French, he would have been no less than to somebody like Foucault or Bourdieu. I can very well tell this is not an exaggeration. So when an academic is like a celebrity, the editors do not want to question. The editors do not want to go for the theoretical rigor. The editors do not want to go for the methodological rigor. So this is the problem in the Caravan article and also in the latest book of Ilaiah. And also in the book Why I'm Not Hindu, Ilaiah actually speaks of the literal traditions of Hinduism. These literal traditions in Hinduism are promoted by two people in the Antikas writings. One is Kanchaila and second is Siddhalinga in his book, in his autobiography, Urukeri. Now, why should one want to promote the literal tradition of Hinduism? See, all these village gods are part of the literal tradition. I would want to borrow Aristotle and Marx, where both have said, Aristotle was the first one to say that political theory is part of politics. When political theory is part of politics, why should Ilaiah even say, let's say about a Pochamma or a Maisamma or any of the village goddess? Hinduism is not afraid of these articulation of Professor Ilaiah. Here, I would disagree with the BSF's articulation today. The BSF's public talk is, today's public talk is, words are weapons. The writings of Ilaiah, the words of Ilaiah are not weapons to Hinduism per se. They're only weapons to BJP. They're only weapons to the current day RSS. But if you go in the intellectual history, or if you try to see, if you evaluate the Indian political thought, Ilaiah's writing will not be a problematic to the Hindu political thought. So when Ailaya's writings are not a problem to Hindu political thought, of course, it will, it will not be accepted in the same intellectual continuity of Phule, Ambedkar, or Kanshiram. And there is a major break. There is actually a major break. I would disagree with my earlier speaker who said that Ambedkar social democracy and Ailaya spiritual democracy. Spiritual democracy is not a replica for social democracy. There is a lot written in philosophy on the difference on the debate between church and the state. Here in India, one must definitely write on the distinction between the temple and the state, which is
time is up.
Yeah,
Please conclude.
Yeah, I'll
conclude with remarks.
Yeah, I'll wind up in, let's say 2 to 5 minutes. There are a couple of
5 minutes is too much. 2 minutes. Yeah.
These are two important points, so I'll just take 5 minutes. So there are some interesting intellectual observations developing from Why I'm Not Hindu. It's almost 25 years, and there are a couple of intellectual histories emerging from Why I'm Not Hindu. One is that speaking against Hindu or anti-Hindu. That is, I Could Not Be Hindu was written by Babar Meghvanshi, and Why I'm Not Hindu is written by Vandana Sonalkar. So this is actually an intellectual history that is weaving out now. And there is another intellectual history that is coming out, that Shashi Tharoor wrote Why I'm Not Hindu. Why I Am a Hindu, Shashi Tharoor is writing. And but Shashi Tharoor is claiming that Hinduism is his way of life, and he himself forgets what is happening within the Nair community. And the major problem that I have with Ailaya's formulation is this. Ailaya argued for Dalitization against Sanskritization and Hindutva. But Ailaya doesn't go back to Ambedkar, because Ambedkar proposed Prabhuddha Bharat in 1956. Though his book was very much unpublished, but from 1990s, this book was available in the public domain and also in English. So, and there are 3 people who are doing this mistake. After Ailaya, Akash Singh Rathore writes Dalit Swaraj, differentiating between W and V, and also Samarata Chaudhary writing Dalit elements of a sentence to come in. So these are the intellectual histories that are emerging from Ailaya's Why I'm Not Hindu. But what one must really do now is, can the work of Ailaya actually influence the Shudra and ensure that the Shudra is out of the Hindu fold? Because Ailaya very well knows the history of Telugu states. He very well was part of the APCLC that was very much in conversation with Dalit Mahasabha, which had written extensively and spoken extensively against the feudalism coming from the Kapus, coming from the Reddis and Kapus, and also the Kammas. Now, if Ailaya is proposing a new political called the Shudra, this category doesn't actually fit in. So these are some of my observations. Thank you. I would be happy to address any question if it is posed to me.
Thank you, Praveen. I'm sure you have a lot to say, but then due to limitation of time, we could not give you more time. And there is acknowledging that there is some discontent after the release of Shudras. The thing to be noted is that this is the first time in the history, actually, emerging research scholars are given an opportunity to work with an established scholar like Professor Kanchaya Ailaya. So they are given, opportunity to write alongside him. So another interesting point you pointed out is speaking against himself. This is an interesting thing, because even I feel when a new category of Shudras, they are made as new protagonists of anti-Brahminism, somewhere it looks like these same groups become victims as well as oppressors. So this is something very confusing in the recent work of Professor Kanchaya Ailaya. So, however, now we'll move on to our next speaker, Professor Soumya Dechama. Professor Soumya Dechama teaches at the Center for Comparative Literature, University of Hyderabad. She currently is a professor and heads the Center for Comparative Literature. Apart from teaching comparative Indian literature and cultural discourse in contemporary India, her research interests include literatures of India, translation studies, minority languages and cultural discourse, Kodava performative cultures. She joined the center in 2004, and prior to teaching in the University of Hyderabad, she taught English in Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. Soumya Dechama was awarded the Fulbright Nehru Academic and Professional Excellence Fellowship for 2019. During this Fulbright, she taught the course Modern Indian Literary Cultures and conducted research on understanding the modern in Queens College, City University of New York. Now I request Professor Soumya Dechama to give her presentation.
Thank you, Anil, and thank you everyone in BSF. As I was telling in the beginning, when we're having a light conversation, I'm honored to be part of this forum today, discussion, and I'm not even sure if I can do justice to Professor Kancha Ilaya's thought, work, and influence. And also given the rigor and very powerful words of both Arvind and Praveen before me. I'm hoping I'm not really off the mark. I'm largely reading from what I wrote for this talk. I need not reiterate that Ilaya is one among the most influential thinkers, philosophers of contemporary India, contemporary world, and also an organic intellectual of our times. And I again thank Bahujan Students Front, University of Hyderabad, first for organizing this, and second for making me part of this. In fact, as an aside, I thought I'll comment on the title for this discussion, which is Where Words Are Weapons, a critical reflection on Professor Kancha Ilaya Shepherd's writing. In fact, Praveen also mentioned this, right? The words are not exactly weapons is what he was arguing, but I'm very glad that it is words and not writing that is in focus today. I've been thinking about language, thinking about speaking a lot in the last 2-3 years, because I think when we say words, this will foreground the everydayness of words, which all of us use, right? No matter what, whether it is academics, whether it is sweeper who sweeps my office, whether it's my family, whoever it is, we all use words to converse, to utter, to speak, to discuss, listen, and participate. Many people have pointed out how speech and talking is much more democratic than writing, right? Which has a very different format. Writing is constituted of words, but then placed very high up in the order of power and privilege. This small note on words has a definite relation also to Ilaya's works, which foregrounds the productive nature of things, and words are of course productive. They are democratic, and unlike writing until recent past, when writing is spreading much more democratically than it was. Yes, like Praveen said, we need to develop writing, improve our own writing, but I would say not by dismissing the power of words spoken or others. So in this discussion today, my attempt is to explore two ideas which I think are very central to Kancha Ilaya's work. One is civilization and the other is Sanskritization. And these are connected. I hope I'll bring this connection and critique them as well. Of course, these ideas are very central precisely because Ilaya brings in a critical view to both these ideas, debunks these ideas scientifically, and also offers certain alternatives. More importantly, civilization and Sanskritization have a particular currency today. They're quite popular today, have held various currencies throughout history. And today, as always, they're also associated with electoral politics, electoral politics. And therefore, Ilaya's ideas on these seem all the more relevant. Just 3 days ago, my daughter, who is 9-year-old, was sitting in her social science class, which is online and their home. So I was around and I heard the class teacher discussing about history and civilization. And the teacher asked the students to look up what civilization meant. My daughter turned to me and asked, Amma, what is civilization? How can one describe civilization to a 9-year-old kid? I attempted many answers, telling her how civilization can be many things. I also told her, for me, ideally, civilization is a condition of society where everybody are equal and free. And the next day, she was somewhat satisfied, but next day I was preparing for this talk, reading Ilaya's Turning the Pot, Tilling the Land. And then I called my daughter and said, here is the answer to your question, what is civilization? And the task for her this week is to read that book. So, but what exactly is civilization, right? The word, as we know now, comes from the Latin word civitas or city. And this is why the most basic definition of the word civilization is a society made up of cities. Of course, all of us can see there is a problem with this definition. It not only excludes people living in the outskirts, people living in the peripheries, villages, hills, forests, and people, it also excludes people who are not organized into a state which has a centralized power. So dominant understanding of civilization has always equated with a certain kind of culture, right? And actually the connection with Sanskritization starts here because early anthropologists in late 19th and mid early 20th centuries use this term civilization and civilized society to differentiate between societies culturally superior. Of course, most of these people who wrote thought of themselves as culturally superior to what they found culturally inferior, from colonizers, from missionaries to upper caste academics, a whole range of others, right? And interestingly, civilization, of course, when somebody claims civilizationally superior, the other side, right, whom they claim inferior, is referred to as barbaric. Now, as you know, Elias' book makes this reference to barbar, where he notes that barbar comes from, again, Latin barba, which means beard, right, gaddam. So, as shaving spread through the world, I quote, men of unshaven societies came to be known as barbarians, meaning the unbarbered. So, in common imagination, barbaric is the opposite of civilization. It is something what is uncultured. Although Ilaya gives a scientific explanation to the practice of cutting the beards, note that the idea of civilization is not just ethnocentric, right? When you say somebody is barbaric, it is definitely ethnocentric, but it is also very gendered if it is referring to the notion of beard and being civilized and so on and so forth. But this is just an aside. So we also have civilization that has been considered morally good and culturally advanced, and other societies being morally wrong and backward. And it's very important here to remember Walter Benjamin, who said, I'm also very fond of quoting this statement, which says, at the same time, a document of barbarism. So we see that we have a very complicated history, which makes defining civilization very, very difficult, not just to my 9-year-old daughter, but to all of us. So how does Ilaya contribute to our ideas of civilization? I quote, much of my reading in the last couple of days, I have read Ilaya throughout, but in order to prepare for this, I've largely dependent on tilling the land, turning the pot and tilling the land. I quote from that book, labor is the lifeblood of civilization. Labor is the process of generating oneself and regenerating others. The fruits of one individual's labor sustain other lives too. Labor is the source of life. Labors have an organic relationship with science and technological practice, and labor is the best form of prayer. Ilaya further argues that in the history of the subcontinent and also elsewhere, forms of labor have been relegated to inferior positions, despite every society being dependent on labor. He also points to how labor is not just framed with a caste structure, but is also gendered. Most importantly, using examples from caste-based occupations that are lowered down and devalued historically, whichever they may be: hunting, gathering, leatherwork, cleaning, cattle herding, farming, pottery, barbers, weaving. Ilaya points to how societies, civilizations are made possible with these labors. What inspires me is this: Ilaya not just historically situates this labor, shows us how they are devalued in the process of what is called civilization, but he turns civilization on its head and brings in a whole lot of positive value to what is called the barbaric, which is associated with labor. He points out how it is indeed that these labors that constitute civilization. Labor is the lifeblood of civilization precisely because no society can survive without these labor practices. But these labors are the scientific bedrock on which any civilized society stands. A civilization, therefore, not just has to integrate science, society, history, art of laboring, right? Cleaning is as much as art, as much as it is science. Example like pottery or anything else. But it has to integrate the dignity of labor into every aspect of labor, which implies an equality and interdependence of people who are part of any society, which thereby means that we need to kick out the loaded term civilization altogether. What is also of immense value in Ilaya's work is that he assigns intellectual and emotional contact to intellectual and emotional quotient to physical labor. Uh, we cannot, for example, work in the farm or make shoes unthinkingly, right? There is an intellectual, there is a thinking process that goes to it, goes to physical labor. But unlike physical labor, mental labor can be completely devoid of physical labor and sometimes emotional labor too. Moreover, the way in which civilization or Sanskritization have been understood, it mostly alienates people not just from nature, not just from labor, but it alienates civilization and Sanskritization, alienate people as well, right? And therefore, interdependence, dignity, equality are for us the keywords and not a vague, very loaded idea of civilization. There are some issues, perhaps questions also when we talk about positing values, these labors, despite them being scientific, despite them being very the foundation of any society. Is there a kind of romanticization of these acts, right? These acts of labor. And of course, like Praveen and even Arvind pointed out before me, there is a hierarchical relationship between the laboring castes and classes. So how do we address this hierarchy between these labors? It's not just that there is a hierarchy between the non-productive castes and the productive classes, but also among the productive castes, there is an hierarchy, and this kind of romanticizing seems to dismiss or not take into consideration this hierarchy. Whether in this globalizing world, right, the value we would like to posit into this kind of labor, how does it work? And are these labors interchangeable, right? And how do we actually move forward towards a kind of free and equal and interdependent life sustaining lives in this changing kind of economy is something that we have to find answers for. Now, Sanskritization briefly. Not just because Sanskritization has been appropriated by contemporary politics, but it has also been the major frameworks to understand caste Indian society. And most models that are used to understand caste, be it colonial framework, nationalist framework, or even Sanskritization framework, they all majorly have produced a consensual imagination of Hindu society. This is a quote from Ankit Kavade. The model of Sanskritization is seen valid a valid process, despite being a process that wrongly limits the people of lower caste as imitators of caste Hindu ritual habits. The problem with Sanskritization is that it has been understood as the only path towards being cultured, quote unquote, towards being civilized, and lower caste people have been seen as passive imitators of these cultures without any agency of their own. Their practices and cultures which are devalued, which Ilaiah tries to bring back into discourse by giving them a certain dignity and sanctity. Moreover, as Ilaiah points out, the practices of Dalit Bahujans that are now widespread among the twice-born castes, like meat eating, for example, are also conveniently brushed aside in this idea of Sanskritization. So both Sanskrit and Sanskriti, the root words from which Sanskritization is derived, suggest an act that brings perfection in matters of culture, language, literature, behavior, and so on. And it is a commonly used word for refinement, for sophistication, and also perfection. We also understand this. We also understand that these meanings are not just connotative. What exactly refined language, refined culture, and behavior translate into are cultures and practices of the upper caste. And this is what precisely it means in M.N. Srinivas's usage. M.N. Srinivas, who coined the term and theorized the term a Sanskritization. So in effect, Sanskritization means being cultured, being civilized, and it can stand for a Hindu civilization, in effect, Hinduization of the Hindu caste society. Ilaiah's thesis, from what I understand, from what I want to understand, is that Sanskritization is not civilization. It is actually exactly the opposite, right? Which is to say that Sanskritization is barbaric. In fact, Srinivas's work attributed civilizing tendencies to Sanskritization, which Ilaiah and many other scholars also have proven logically wrong. Sanskritization runs contrary to civilization precisely because it recognizes and accepts a hierarchy of Brahmanism, precisely because it is unproductive. And I quote Ilaiah here. Though Hindu nationalist modernity, this is from his the edited volume Wages of Freedom, though Hindu nationalist modernity on which the idea of Sanskritization was built was constructed with reference to European, particularly British practices of modernity, the indigenous sources of modernity that were rooted in Dalit Bahujan productive and proto-scientific processes were never examined as the science of the soil. Ilaiah further argues how the so-called modern practices of nationalists, Sanskriticists, that sought to reform upper caste practices regarding women were already present among the Bahujans. Their practices of daily life that are non-Brahminic or even anti-Brahminic, which are away from caste practices, are grounded in science and are practices beyond Sanskritized tradition and move towards a society that is again equal and dignified. In fact, there is a comparatist called Eric Chaffetz who argues that these kind of construction of identities of the marginalized can be understood as translation. Right? It is a translation. Such theories of Sanskritization or Orientalism also, these are translations of a particular people of a particular kind. Translation then, she says, is inseparably connected with the civilizing mission, the bearing of Christianity and Western letters to barbarians. It is a imperialist mission, in fact, one of translation, the translation of other into the terms of the empire, the prime term, which is barbarian. So Christianity here has to be substituted by Hinduism, right? Why is that so? Because Sanskritization is translating a whole lot of practices of the Dalit Bahujans into the framework of Sanskritization, not into understanding on their own terms, but translating into a Hindu framework, like the Christians translated the indigenous peoples. Yes, I will end here maybe with an anecdote, which also kind of makes sense as to why the Brahmin anthropologists like M.N. Srinivas found perfect reason in civilizing the different non-Brahminic non-Brahminic, if not barbaric Kodavas or Kurks, on whom Srinivas's idea of Sanskritization is based. And it also happens to be the community to which I belong. So this anecdote is like this, and I have mentioned this anecdote many times before, but I would like to retell it again. I have been working on Sanskritization for some time now. And while I was working, writing one of these in the last couple of years, I had visited my father, who is in Kodagu, Coorg. And he has been in Coorg throughout his life. He's 82 now. He was a school teacher. And when I went home, we were catching up on the village gossip. And my father reminded me about the suicide of a Brahmin man of Tulu origin in our village, which is East Nemala in Coorg. Of course, I remembered that this man had committed suicide, and sadly, it was a sad thing. And then my father added that his wife had recently remarried. And I was surprised, and I said that this was really nice. A Brahmin woman is getting remarried. And my father continued. He said in Kodava, Ikkikka Pattamalu modern Ayanundu, which means these days Brahmins are also getting to be modern. I thought this is a perfect translation of how it is actually the other way, who need to be civilized, who need to be more democratic, who need to be more open, right? Moving towards a certain kind of modernity is not exactly the Bahujan's task, but it is actually the twice born caste task. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Soumyadechamma. It's become very difficult to comprehend, I mean, summarize what you have said so far. But thank you for making your presentation, and especially bringing forth two themes, Sanskritization as well as civilization, and how they are connected to electoral politics, and how Ilaya debunks them, and how certain professions are not just ethnocentric, but also are gendered. Thank you for throwing light on the other works of Ilaya, especially Turning the Pot and Tilling the Land. And as you mentioned, no civilization sustains without labor and dignity of labor. Physical labor requires both intellectual and physical involvement, but on the contrary, but for just an intellectual activity, physical labor is not a necessity. But unfortunately, there is a hierarchy in labor and people involved in it. So Sanskritization, for Kanchayalaya, Sanskritization is not civilization. It rather runs contrary to civilization due to its roots being in hierarchy. So thank you for making your presentation. And now we have our next speaker, V. Geeta. V. Geeta is a publisher and co-director of Tara Books, Chennai, and a well-known scholar working on feminism and caste. Some of her path-breaking works include Patriarchy, Gender, and Towards a Non-Brahmin Millennium. She has been consistently engaged in writing and translation work and has been actively contributing to various magazines and news portals. Some of her notable publications are Translation. But am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Anil, yeah.
She has been consistently engaged in writing and translation work and has been actively contributing to various magazines and news portals. Some of her notable publications are translation of 2 novels of Perumal Murugan in Tamil into English, and other works Towards a Non-Brahmin Millennium, From Ayodhitas to Periyar, co-authored with S.V. Rajadurai. And another one, Undoing Impunity, Speech After Sexual Violence, Religious Faith, Ideology, Citizenship, The View from Below, co-authored with Nalini Rajan Kita. She is now engaged in writing, teaching, and research on subjects related to women. In 1998, she joined Tara Books as an editorial director and has been associated with various kinds of art and literary projects and mythology and indigenous tribal and folk traditions since then. She is currently researching the works and thoughts of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Now I request Professor V. Geeta to take over the session.
Thank you very much, Anil, and the Bahujan Students Front for asking me to be part of this seminar where we get to discuss Professor Ailaya's work. I'm very pleased to be sharing this stage with extremely erudite student participants, because I think the kind of stimulating questions that Arvind and Praveen have raised also give us pause and make us rethink some of our own assumptions. So thanks for that. And Soumya has actually given me a good point of departure for my own presentation with the anecdote that she ended her speech with. And I think, to me, Kancha's life and work symbolize exactly that he has, for a huge part of his life as a public intellectual, sought to invite the Brahmin Banyas into a civilized encounter on the terrain of language. So this sort of civility that his invitation to dialogue, however provocative it might be, however critical it might be, it remains a dialogue that he wants people to engage in, to be part of. And for me, my earliest memory of Kancha really is in being in dialogue, in civil conversation with him. I don't know if he remembers this, but this was way back in 1995. I had gone with him for a PUCL meeting in Pondicherry. In fact, I had gone as his translator. He and the late KG Kannabiran and had been invited by the PUCL to speak. And I was sent along to translate both of them into Tamil. And we had this early morning walk somewhere, and we had this extremely spirited conversation on feminism, whether feminism sort of can mean one thing or many things, the relationship between caste and gender. And while we agreed on some things, we also disagreed fairly intensely on many other things. But through all of this, there was this great civility in keeping a conversation going, and no foreclosure of a relationship in the future because we held different positions on certain issues. And I think that is, for me, very valuable. And it's a stance that Kancha has always adopted and continues to adopt. And the fact that he's sitting here listening to this sort of fairly fundamental critique of his work is testimony to the civility that anti-caste traditions in this country have always sought to urge forth. So I want to sort of start with that. And I also want to go on to talk about Kancha's way of being as an intellectual. And once again, I'd like to share an anecdote. This, I think, has to do with a conference that both of us were part of at some point in the late 1990s, where, among other things, the discussion veered around to questions to do with the environment. And I remember Kancha sort of holding this little plastic cup up, throwing it down, stamping on it, and saying that just to put this away in the right sort of waste disposal system cannot constitute an environmental practice, and that it has to take into account the whole waste and sanitary economy of this country, which I think was a thought that hadn't occurred to almost anyone at that conference. And to me, these two aspects of Kancha's way of intellectual being, civility on the one hand, and this performative intensity on the other, these have rendered him the kind of very distinctive intellectual presence that he is in the Indian context. So dramatic, performative, incisive, brilliant, polemical, provocative, but all times very attentive to the anxieties of history, to the times, to what is required of us in the here and now. And this is how I see the intervention around the category Shudra, which has resulted in this volume. What might we do with this category in the light of the challenges we face with Hindutva, but also the emergence of a political practice and a political leadership that appears to be aligned with the interests of the so-called Shudra communities, but which might actually not really address the kinds of historical, economic, and sociological concerns that Kancha and many others have called attention to with respect to the Bahujan Samaj, so to speak. So in that sense, Kancha's work continues to stimulate us, to push us into examining assumptions that some of us might hold dear, and also provides an opportunity for us to question him and to push the boundaries of his own thought. So in today's presentation, I was asked to focus on his earlier work on God as political philosopher. And while I will sort of take my cues from that book, I hope to also connect it to the rest of his writings in the time allotted to me, so that we can see how we can open up some of the areas of interest that Kancha has outlined in his writings by making them speak to scholarship and debates from other contexts and in other historical moments. So let me start with this book, God as Political Philosopher, which was published in 2001, but which actually is based on his doctoral work, which means that he worked on it in the 1990s. And this work is interesting because it is situated at a point where there is a unity of conjuncture and history. So this is the Mandal Masjid moment on the one hand, but it is also a moment when Dalit Bahujan presence in intellectual life is emerging as a very vital factor of our social existence, in view of the emergence of Dalit movements across the country, which have sort of experienced a resurgence in the early 1990s. And so you had this very exciting conversation that sort of was happening in all the vernaculars, at least in southern India, that was the case, with questions to do with history, identity, language, literature, politics, all of them being subjected to very fundamental questioning and interrogation. So this particular text emerged out of that context, a context that was defined by the conjuncture, but which also took on weighty historical questions. So if I were to place this book in the context of his other writings, I would want to do so in terms of three strands. One is Kancha's interest in the nature of what we call history. His determination to see history as not something that can be sort of gleaned from text. And here Arvind spoke about the importance of experience and how the village, and Kancha himself speaks about this in his memoirs, that the village continues to be both archive and the present, and how one might sort of look and understand the past from within the living archive of the village of rural India. So in that sense, for him, history has always been processual, something alive, something dynamic, and most important, something that has been contested. And so he is very loath to submit to a version of history that records in whatever manner the triumphant march of what we might sort of call, following many others who have done so, Hindu civilization, keeping in mind Soumya's very wonderful unpacking of the term civilization. So Kancha has constantly sought to show us how the civilizational sense that the hegemonic Hindu notion of history has must be punctured, and how might we puncture it. And here he does two or three things. One is he refuses to sort of see this puncturing as something provincial, that it cannot be understood only in terms of, say, the so-called little traditions or the regional traditions. Neither can it be sort of seen only in terms of what has survived in the lives of indigenous communities or Adivasis, but as something that is ongoing, that is there, that is latent, and which has to be identified. And so this then becomes a very important aspect of how you would then look to history to make sense of the present. Because this is not a history that is only present in text and monument. It is also a history that is part of the way lives are being led, but which haven't been grasped, understood, or critically foregrounded. And I think the text that Soumya referred to, which is one of my favorite texts, Turning the Pot and Tilling the Field, I think that points to the ways in which we need to sort of look to production and labor ways of existence to grasp the actual making and the makers of history in this subcontinent. So that's one thing. And in this context, Why does Kancha bring in the Buddha? That's one question that we need to keep in mind. The second thing is, if history is to be reposed as a knowledge of the producing and the laboring life worlds that have made this civilization, then how might we understand this society? And here Kancha offers a very tantalizing sort of restatement of the class struggle as between the producing and the parasitic classes. And as we all know, within the anti-caste traditions, there have been insistent efforts on re-theorizing caste and class from Phule's own time onwards, and of course with Ambedkar, and consistently by those who've been associated with the left, but who've also sought to interrogate it, like Kancha himself. And so this whole reposing of the nature of the social contradiction and the economic contradiction in terms of the producing and parasitic classes is, I think, a very productive way of retaining a contemporary interest in this question. And I shall come to that in a minute. But I think that is also a point of reference for Kancha when he looks to the Buddha. The third thing is, of course, the regimes of culture, which have emerged out of skilled and aesthetic labor from life worlds where you cannot easily disambiguate the doing of labor from considerations of skill and beauty. And what might these worlds yield us by way of a cultural vision? And again, here for him, the Buddha becomes very important. And so what he then does in this book on God as political philosopher, apart from making a case for taking the Buddha seriously as a political philosopher, he also points to what we might have to do by way of reconceptualizing history. What are the methodological tools we might need to adopt? And here, by looking at the Jatakas and by the particular kinds of texts from the Pali canon that he does, he shows us that much of what the Buddha had to say about the nature of polity and the state emerged from the very visceral, empirical details of material life that you find in the Buddhist literature. So in that sense, the Buddha's own expositions of, say, the social contract, so to speak, which he dwells on, or the emergence of the state and how the Buddha understands it, all of this owes a great deal to the wealth of references to material life in the Buddhist literature. And this is something that Ambedkar also points to in his student essay on ancient Indian commerce, where he says the Jatakas are the only source material for us to reconstruct an economic history of India, because the Brahmanical literature doesn't have any references to life as it perhaps was actually lived in those times. So you have Kancha doing that exactly here, that with the kind of claims he makes for Buddha as a political philosopher, because this is a political philosopher who knows his polity and economy very well. And the second thing is, of course, this whole understanding of society as divided into the producing and parasitic classes. And here Kancha brings in the Buddha's views on property, on the beneficial state, and how might these be understood? Because these are premised on an understanding of labor and production as essentially life affirming, and the duty of the monarch or of the state as playing a very important medial role in ensuring production that is undertaken on fair grounds without departing from the tenets of the Dhamma. So this sort of very interesting ethical lens that the Buddha brings to politics and economics is something that Kancha foregrounds as important in his understanding of the Buddha as a political philosopher. And likewise, when it comes to culture, when it comes to the life worlds that the working communities of those that we might call Dalit, Bahujans, and Adivasis produce, the Buddha is very conscious of the fact that what is very fundamental to an understanding of the ideal polity is the equality of existence, not the equality of selves, because the whole notion of self is very complicated in Buddhist thought, since the self is not a stable given entity. But there is a sort of equality that is fundamental and foundational to the Buddha's understanding, and that comes from the Buddha's affirmation of what Kancha calls the right to life. And here, perhaps you might want to remember that he was very active in the civil rights movement, and it's not accidental that he brings in the language of rights and situates that within the Buddhist canonical texts. So what in effect Kancha does in this book is he attempts to bring together different traditions of thinking about history and society. One is the long anti-caste tradition, of which he knows and foregrounds in an experiential sense, sometimes hearkening back to Phule when he does that, but at other times drawing from his intimate knowledge of the rural hinterland, where he speaks with great pleasure and confidence about the producing, laboring lives and the worldviews that emerge from those lives, and how those stand to um, sort of emerge into a more just and a more equal way of existence in conversation with ideals that the Buddha has defined. So you have the Buddha as a sort of inspirational historical figure on whom the histories of Dalit Bahujans and Adivasis can hope to rely on to both create the universalism that is already latent and immanent in their life worlds, and to find a way of making that universalism relevant to our times. So he's basically trying to straddle two very distinctive traditions of being and thinking within our subcontinental history. And I think that is a fascinating exercise. And even his interesting views on language can be understood within this context, where he sees English as opening up the world for the Dalit Bahujans and Adivasis, just as it did it for him, as he recounts in his memoirs. English brought Karl Marx to him, as he says. So in that sense, the Buddha is part of that whole conceptual framework where you need a universalizing philosophical, political worldview which will help anchor the latent universalism of Dalit Bahujan Adivasis. And without this anchoring, we will perhaps run into those issues that Arvind and Praveen have outlined, especially in terms of how do you address hierarchy? How do you address a polity which is not committed to the destruction of caste or to a challenging of Hinduism, but which stands to be co-opted by either? So by bringing the Buddha into the equation, Ilaya tries to address the issues of hierarchy, inequality, and exploitation, but at the same time keeps alive his argument about the civilizational centrality of Dalit Bahujan Adivasi existence. And I think this double move is something we may want to sort of keep track of and ask how might this double move then be made to speak to our concerns and our times. And here I want to sort of bring Ilaya's work in conversation with work that has been done in other parts of the country and within specific disciplines. In the rest of my talk, this is what I wish to do. One is, of course, there's been a creative outpouring of writing on Buddhism, especially Neo-Buddhism as it has emerged in Maharashtra, but also more generally on Buddhism as political philosophy, given the very sad record of Buddhist politics in Sri Lanka and Burma. And this has encouraged people to rethink the understanding of politics from within a Buddhist framework, and it has led to some very interesting studies, including Christopher Queen's important work on engaged Buddhism. And I think if one were to sort of see Buddhism as a historical inheritance, where the actual material nature of Buddhist polities has seldom sort of borne out the normative promises of the Buddha's creed, but yet that normative framework continues to be very important and central. How might we then think of the relationship between norm and practice? And what the work of those who have looked at engaged Buddhism does is to look at specific historic examples. For instance, the whole Dharmantar movement in Maharashtra, and what has become of Neo-Buddhism. How might we understand that? What has that meant? And how might that hold a direction for the future? What are its limitations? So that is a very interesting and fascinating literature in itself. And it has given rise to some very important historical studies as well, especially about what we might call pre-Ambedkarite Buddhism, the efforts to engage with the Buddha in the 19th century and in the 20th century prior to Dharmantar. For example, we know the work of Pandit Ayotidas, thanks to Aloysius's writings in English. Many of us can access that. But also equally the work of others in the realm of Buddhism, for example, Swami Bodhanand in Bhikkhu Bodhanand in the former United Provinces, the work undertaken by people like Beni Madhav Barua in Bengal, in former Bengal and Assam. So there's been some really interesting historical studies as well that have emerged, and these might well help us rethink the whole idea of Buddhist normative political philosophy and thought, and how might we make that speak to the concerns of anti-caste histories and struggles. This in terms of scholarship and pedagogy could be a very valuable exercise. The second thing is, of course, the realm of history, and a lot of work has since taken place in terms of how we might look at Buddhism as well as the Shudra and Dalit questions. And one of the people that has, one of the traditions of thought here at work, and Kancha references that in his book, is that pioneered by Sharad Patil in Maharashtra, the Phule, Ambedkar, Marxwadi traditions of thinking about history, of thinking about the present, which has emerged as a contrapuntal conversation with the left, but has also gone on to raise very important questions in the realm of philosophy and political practice, and very importantly, gestured towards what feminist historiography might teach us in terms of how this Varna Jati complex has emerged in Indian history. And I think that is also an important section of scholarship that we might be interested in looking at in terms of placing Kancha in a comparative context. The second kind of scholarship is, of course, feminism itself, because I think some of the most important and intriguing aspects of Kancha's understanding of Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi life worlds is the primacy he grants to women's role and women's labor, and the centrality of women as not simply producers and makers, but as knowledge creators. Now, this is something that also is present in Phule, that the Shudra woman, that the Mahar and Muang presences in village life of Mahar and Muang women, they constitute a section of society which has the potential to put forth a life world and a philosophy drawn from their own experiences in production and reproduction. This is something that is immanent in Phule's thought. And Kancha picks that up and does something quite fascinating with it in his writings. And his whole early acquaintance with feminism in Hyderabad and elsewhere has made for a very interesting conversation. And I think that conversation, if it is placed in interaction with the kinds of debates that have emerged within feminist thought, especially in terms of how might the feminist question be reposed from an anti-caste position, from a position that takes into account the very distinctive historical experiences of Adivasis and of Bahujan women, what might Indian feminism then look like? Rather than assume polarized positions on this subject, there has been some very interesting work, again, in Maharashtra, coming from within three distinctive traditions: the Bahujan tradition, the Dalit tradition, and the work undertaken by, say, the Women's Studies Department at the University of Pune, which situates itself at the cross section of these two traditions, and then makes claims for a Dalit standpoint feminism, and from there a broader argument about feminist reason itself, and what might feminist reason help us to do, how feminist reason has to then account for the multiple nature of identity and social existence in the Indian context, how it necessarily would have to engage with Dalit studies, with the whole question of the Phule Nana Patil tradition in Maharashtra. So I think some very interesting ideas were opened up by that world of scholarship and classroom practice. And I think in terms of bringing this whole Dalit Bahujan sociology and history as outlined by Kancha into the classroom, the work undertaken by the Women's Studies Department in terms of pedagogy can prove a very productive point of debate and argument. Then finally, the one area where I think very little work has been done in terms of expanding Kancha's concerns is the science and technology studies. And I think there's been some very important breakthroughs in thinking of science and technology. Some of us are familiar with Ajanta Subramanian's work, which is the Caste of Merit, which really takes a caste lens to the evolution of Indian science, Indian technology, Indian technological and engineering education, and so on. And I think there is a very important tradition that Kancha has put in place with turning the pot and tilling the field, which I think makes us, would really push historians of science in the Indian context, as well as science and technology studies, into restating their premises. And that could be a very valuable beginning, because that's an area of work that has seldom been addressed from precisely this point of view. And while I was reading Ajanta's book, it struck me that what Ajanta has tried to point out is something that the anti-caste tradition has always been invested in. And she actually references the debates in the Madras presidency, the early 20th century, those that unfolded under the aegis of the Justice Party of the South Indian Liberal Federation, the first non-Brahmin party in the South. And that's not accidental, because they viewed themselves as producing communities and wanted an educational system that answered to their understanding and experience of life. And put that along with Kancha's acute interest in social justice, as you see in a book such as Turning the Pot and Tilling the Field, then you have a very important epistemic task that awaits us, especially in light of all the claims that are being made for this new education policy today. Many of us are stuck with the language question and with the religious question, but equally important is the question of science, technology, skill, and who really are the bearers of scientific knowledge in the Indian context, and how might we take that whole idea of what Kancha does in post-fascist India, who are the makers of scientific knowledge, into another realm of discussion. So I think in a lot of important ways, the book on the Buddha stands in a kind of a medial location as far as his oeuvre is concerned. So you have the very rich polemical arguments on why I'm not a Hindu. Then you have this amazing life worlds that he opens up in Turning the Pot and Tilling the Field. And also, Anil, I'll be finishing in 3 minutes. And then you have him also, and here this is one of my favorite books, a wonderful short story that he did for a project that was taken forward by Anveshi on a story called Mother, where the whole centrality of women to the productive laboring life was urged forth. I think that work, the life worlds of Dalit Bahujan Adivasis, and then his subsequent political arguments about winning the Shudras over to the anti-caste revolution, and all the problems that have implicit in that project, which Praveen and others have pointed out. And I think to address those problems and retain this rich sense of civilization that he has been urging forth, his work on the Buddha, if sort of opened up to these various other conversations, might help us move from this kind of impasse we sometimes find ourselves in when we are caught by the present. And while staying with the present, how might we go beyond the present, and then look also to some utopian future? And I think we're all invested in that kind of a utopia as well. Kancha himself is. I mean, he writes so warmly of Robert Owen in his memoirs. So I think sort of by marking the ground in this manner, I want to sort of point to a lot of work that still remains to be done with Kancha's writings, and whether problematizing them or learning from them. I just want to end by saying thank you, Kancha.
Thank you, ma'am. Sorry for cutting short your conversation. Ma'am has broadly covered almost all the works of Kancha Iyer, especially shedding light on his famous work, God as Political Philosopher, and how Professor Kancha Iyer made an attempt in understanding history from the archive of lived experiences, and how hegemonic Hindu notions has to be punctured through this methodology. history has to be made sense in the present, and how Kanchailaya understanding, how Kanchailaya understands producing and parasitic classes. His understanding of history has clash between producing class and parasitic classes. And thank you for digging deep into his well-acclaimed work, and how this book is an important piece alongside other works on Buddhism, and how Kanchailaya constitutes women as knowledge producers, similar to what Jyotiba Phule has projected. Thank you for giving several other points. Thank you for bringing several other points into discussion. Now we have our final speaker, Professor Y.S. Alon. Professor Y.S. Alon is a professor in Visual Studies, School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and has written on ancient Indian art, critique of Walker's Pink, Buddhist caves, modern Indian art, neo-Buddhist visual culture, Dr. Ambedkar's critical framework. He is engaged in conceptual formulation of protected ignorance. His critical engagement with the concept of protected ignorance has been explained through article and lecture text. He was nominated as ICCR Chair, Visiting Professor in Shenzhen University, China. He has lectured widely in India and abroad. He has been member of various academic bodies and government committees. He has been engaged in popular lectures as part of social movement. His recently published work is Early Western Indian Buddhist Caves, Forms and Patronage. He is also a former member of UDSF, JNU. Now I request Professor Y.S. Alon to give his presentation.
Thank you. Thanks for an invite. And how much time do I have? Please tell me so that I speak accordingly.
25 minutes, sir.
Okay, fair enough. I think that's sufficient enough for me. It's very difficult to summarize everything, and I greatly appreciate the earlier speakers for summarizing a lot of things, and also quite an important aspect like what Gita has analyzed as far as God as a political philosopher is concerned. And then Kancha's engagement actually begins with that particular book, and then he moves on. And how one has to see the larger body of work which he has produced. At the outset, let me say something. You know, me and a lot of my other friends of UDSF who have been the founder members of the UDSF in JNU had a great conversations with Kancha, and surprisingly, Kancha never acknowledges or even does not mention in any of his book. So that is quite a surprising fact for me. I don't know why he always misses that particular moment, because the intellectual engagement is not a uniform one. It is always often collective one, and through collective participation, we develop certain ideas, certain ethos, certain thought process. Having said that, let me begin that the idea of self-consciousness as a critical framework, or the self as an intervening category, or rather the self-consciousness as an intervening category in order to produce any knowledge or any research as such, is a very important aspect. But at the same time, whether that self-consciousness has moral self-consciousness, and consequently is there a mind consciousness. So one has to see very critically as to how there are certain operating principles through which you try to present a worldview, and then how the normatives which exist in the society even today, or for that matter, what Kancha attempts to analyze those normatives. And these normatives in the Kancha's work becomes a very important intervening category in order to project the entire mass of the Shudra community in the present day India as a part, not only as a material production, but also as a part of the knowledge production process. So, one has to situate this kind of a conditionality and the moral burden through which Kancha has evolved himself, and at the same time, is there a self-critical, in a critical self, rather, I would say, is there a critical self? And whether that critical self is really pointing or moving towards creating any kind of an enabling process. So this is where the real quest matter. And therefore what one has to see is the ways in which the idea of Hindu identity has been produced and imposed in the Indian situation, in the political sphere during the colonial times, or even the pre-colonial times. And in the colonial times, it gets so much thick and it gets advocated as a part of larger Brahminical project. And in this larger Brahminical project, whether the Shudra communities of India, whether they wish to take a pride or they wish to be part of those pride, and consequently the whole idea of pride of being Hindu and being caste Hinduness, because the caste Hinduness is all about hate. It's all about violence. It's all about anger. And therefore, one has to see how these aspects of hate, anger, violence gets ghettoized and also constantly getting re-inscribed among the Shudra communities. Now let us take the example what even a lot of people have talked about, or even what Kancha talks about, the whole idea of Kshatriyatva. In the colonial India and in the post-colonial India, the idea of Kshatriyatva is achieved by butchering the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribe communities, by the non-scheduled caste and the non-scheduled tribe communities. That has been a phenomenon. And even for that matter, the scheduled caste women are raped right in front of the Shudra women. And the Shudra women does not have a capacity to protest or to be part of the gender community. And what are those factors which really develop those kind of inhibitions? So the nature of developing of inhibitions are to do with whole aspect of the self-consciousness or the righteousness which a particular community or a person really has. And at the same time, this righteousness in the rationality is very important. The ways in which Habermas differentiates between the instrumental rationality and emancipatory rationality. Now, Kancha is not interested in defining or differentiating what exactly Habermas is doing, but certainly he is analyzing the public sphere in India largely from the dominant caste Hindu perspective, which basically constitutes what today we call as OBC communities. Now, how you really understand the whole logic of social, spiritual, economic, and educational deprivation? You see, the deprivation in education today is very difficult to make out. You may say that there is a denial in the in the representation when it comes to the OBCs in the field of the medical sciences. But certainly there are number of engineers and a lot of other people who are getting educated even from the Shudra communities. And irrespective of becoming engineers, the Hawa or the dominance of idea of divinity and sacred does not go away. Whether it is Kamma engineer, whether it is Maratha engineer, whether it is any kind of an engineer or doctor, or for that matter, any technocrat, or the appellation of so-called educated or the so-called degree holder, even including PhD and all, because it is so difficult to come out of the whole logic of Tirumal Tirupati Devasthana. Even if you take the example of Andhra, or if you take the example of Maharashtra, the Sai Baba syndrome is so powerful and so influencing that this whole idea of divine and sacred gets constantly reinscribed in the public sphere. Now, what one also see is that the survival which Kancha talks about as part of small spiritual survival, the communities who are surviving, I think one has to see it is more like a self-defense mechanism in the ways in which Radhakrishnan has also developed this mechanism that the Hinduism survived, like the caste is an answer to the Muslim onslaught and all those things. So and that is a kind of a logic he plays when it comes to the philosophical explanation of defending the caste system and defending the Hindus. Now, in a much nuanced way, what one has to see is that whether it is Radhakrishnan, whether it is Aurobindo, whether it is Vivekanand, whether it is Gandhi, whether it is even Tagore, these are all the people who are Vedantic, and Vedantics have never ever created structures of equality. Now one has to see whether the text which is being produced by Kancha has that enabling process or not, and whether it is whether it is enough to fight this Vedantism and see as to how, when you talk about slavery, the mental slavery, in current situation and in today's educational system, why do you want to get imposed? That is one question which one has to pose. And why do you accept that dominance? That means something at a mental level, there is a problem, and that problem needs to be addressed very seriously. Now, the whole logic of Dalitization, which Kancha advocates, and I always confronted with that logic. What kind of a Dalitization you mean? Because Dalit is not a homogeneous category. It's a multi-caste. It's not a homogeneous category. Or even for that matter, caste is not homogeneous. The scheduled caste is not homogeneous. The OBCs is not a homogeneous category. There are a number of castes which are there in those lists. There are a number of communities. So what do you mean by that, this whole logic of Dalitization? Eating meat, eating beef, or this thing, this is Dalitization. I mean, these are the kind of an advocacies which Kancha tries to propose in order to counter the Brahmanical notion of vegetarianism and the Brahmanical ideas of dominance, where the cultural consciousness is so much dominated by this logic of divine and sacred. Now, to me, it is a very false claim. Rather, I would say that what is needed is Ambedkarization of the society and not the Dalitization of the society. Because by following certain traits of certain communities, you do not get empowered. But rather, by following Ambedkar, you do get empowered. And there is this whole logic of shared aspirations that goes in the Ambedkar's writings. So how do you situate Kancha's work in the post annihilation of caste? You see, you need to understand the ways in which Sharad Patil analyzes caste and then goes on further, while especially his caste Kancha is that when it comes to history, he completely, I mean, there is this set narrative that is being followed, and by following that set narrative, I don't think that we are going to understand or we are going to create any kind of an enabling process. You need to go away from that narrative, and at the same time, the problems to or the solution to the existing problems cannot really go in the in this in this I don't know, somebody is posting something very these things, kindly remove that person. It's a very bad thing, and it seems that the Zoom is hacked, what we are trying to do. So kindly remove that person quickly. It's not good. And so coming back to these things is that or even for that matter, how you really counter that Hindu identity, because countering of the identity is very important. One is that you accept that identity, and people are living with that identity, and they are the dominating communities in India who have accepted that kind of an identity and living with that kind of an identity. So it comes to the practice, like you go and do satsang, or anything. Now, whether you are empowering you